Hello and welcome to a quick intro into how to interpret the CodeStat code review reports. I'm guessing since you're listening to this that you've received something like this, and what we're going to do is quickly go over just what you should be looking at and how you should interpret this. When you receive one of these code reports, the information contained within it is generated from the start to the end of the period that you are actually working the code that the LifePak was on. I'll show you in a couple of minutes just where the data comes from and what it looks like in raw form. And this is kind of a summary sheet. Up at the top, you'll often see when the machine was powered on, the date and time, as well as some other kind of general information from the device. There is no patient identifying information such as name or date of birth, so this is HIPAA safe information. At the top of the sheet, you will see two dials. What these give you is a average percentage of the total time that you are doing compressions. There's a goal of 70 to 95 or so percent, and the goal is to hit in the mid or upper of that range. Obviously, the more time that you are doing compressions, the more time the patient is getting blood flow, and vice versa. However, there is kind of a too much of a good thing point. If you do have to allow time for ventilation before there's an airway placed, you do have to allow time for shocks and pulse checks. The other dial is the average rate of compressions. So while you were doing compressions, what was the average number of compressions per minute, or the average rate that you were doing? Again, there's a sweet spot here between 100 and 120. Too fast and the heart doesn't have time to fill. Too slow and you're not pumping enough blood. Below these dials, you're going to see what the rhythm was when you initially powered on the device. And then down below, you're going to see minute by minute snapshot of the code itself. This lower section, each line is 1 minute during the time of the resuscitation. Each little red hash mark that you see is a compression. Therefore, sections like this are sections of compressions, and a section without little red hash marks is a pause. At the end of each minute, you'll see a compression ratio. So this is the percentage of time during that minute that you are doing compressions, and for that minute, what your average rate was. You'll see that minute by minute, that varies depending on length of pauses in here. This one with a longer pause, actually there wasn't good data and it was artifact, and that's why it still says compressions were done 100% of the time. Down here you'll see there was a pause and only 68% of the time during that minute were compressions done. And again, you'll see the rate over here. There are a couple other annotations that you'll see in this section. This green bar here refers to return of spontaneous circulation. So here is where a pulse came back, and for this green period until the end of the resuscitation, there was a pulse back. Occasionally we will annotate these with ventilations, which will show up as little blue triangles up above here. However, that data is not quite as reliable as chest compressions, so for now we're relying on the program only for interpretation of chest compressions. Down below this, if there were shocks delivered, you will see a summary of the shocks that were delivered, at what time during the code or resuscitation they were delivered, what the energy was, how long of a pause there was before the shock delivery, and how long a pause there was after the shock delivery before resuming CPR. You recall with the ALS or the ACLS now, our goal is to resume compressions immediately after the shock. You can see these up here as these little triangles with a number. This is shock number 2. You can see there's a short pause before, a little bit of a longer pause afterwards. Shock 1, relatively short pause both before and after. Same with shock number 3. If you are using the end-tidal CO2 on the LifePak, you'll see a readout of minute by minute what the average end-tidal CO2 was. This is somebody who was probably intubated somewhere around in here, and then the end-tidal was hooked up, and for the rest of the resuscitation you can see and trend the end-tidal CO2. This is only if you're using this through the LifePak. If you're hooked up to end-tidal CO2 through a hospital monitor or some other device, obviously it will not read in here. Here's an example of what the ventilations look like. And again, these are not quite as reliable, and we don't use these the majority of the time. You'll see on this resuscitation that compressions were happening much too fast to allow effective filling of the heart. And again, you can see minute by minute trends of that. Often you'll see a pattern similar to this section here, where there's a group of compressions, pause, group of compressions, pause. These usually relate to a patient not having an advanced airway and getting cycles of 30 compressions to 2 ventilations. This is opposed to the more continuous sections, such as down here, which tends to be after they're intubated and you're just doing continuous compressions without the pauses for ventilations. This is what the raw data looks like. Before we print the reports, you can go through every second of the resuscitation. The black line is the electrical activity, like the rhythm strip you would see on the monitor. The green line is what we call the impedance signal, or the effectively where the compressions are. This is measured by the electrical energy passing back and forth between the pads, and it can measure how that is disturbed by the compressions. You can see it's fairly obvious where the compressions are happening in here, and each of those is marked with a little C, and these become those little red hash marks you see on the reports. As opposed to a period where CPR is stopped, you see that that green line doesn't show any of that regular movement that it does when compressions are happening. The LifePak will only record this information if it is set to paddles mode. If you change it to a different lead to check for fine VFib or something, and you remember, please change it back to paddles or else we're unable to collect the information. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, that's okay. It usually defaults to paddles mode, so you should not have to worry about that unless you're actively changing it. So again, there are some things to watch for and to learn from. Things to take away from this are looking at your rates. Are you hitting that goal range? And what can you do to keep yourself in that range? And then how can you minimize unnecessary pauses? Again, there are many necessary pauses, but how do we minimize the big unnecessary ones? Please let me know any questions or clarification, and please share these reports with those that you work with on resuscitations. The best way to use them is as a discussion tool, kind of a debriefing device to talk over the resuscitation afterwards, learn what we can do better the next time, and how we can improve both individually, as a team, and across the whole service. Thank you very much.